Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the best in BC politics. Thanks for bringing us into your ear holes via the podcast stream and the various ways you can get it, or your eye holes through Check Plus. I don't know, it doesn't sound very good when I put it that way, but I know you're enjoying watching us on Check Plus or on Check on Sundays or on YouTube. So thank you for being here. We have a great panel as usual. We're going to bring in our guest first because Jillian Oliver is away this week. So Sarah Miller, who was the former policy director in the BC Green Caucus, now a political strategist, is joining us. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Maclean Kay, editor of the Orca, is here as usual. Hi, Maclean.
Always a pleasure.
And Katy Merrifield, Vice President Wellington Advocacy, is here as well. Hello, Katy.
Hey, Rob. And just a quick message to our viewers. If you're watching this on TV, stay tuned for Mo Amir's show. This is Van Color, which comes after Political Capital. He and I have a super serious debate segment starting called Well, Actually.
That's good. Yes, we had Mo's first show last week on Check and Check Plus as well, so you can catch that. The app is great because you can pick up all of the shows Check is doing, including the past episodes as well. So great. Make sure you stick around for that. Let's head out to our first topic here, which is disaster response part 2. We are still basically processing the first flooding disaster in BC, how the province responded. We're not even done cleaning up with that, but we have been hearing a lot from politicians this week about the next round of weather forecasts, risks, step to prepare for these storms, things like proactive highway closures and a flood hotline. We've got help here already from Alberta. The military is on the ground. Doesn't address some of the fundamental criticisms about BC's system that we've talked about in the past. But let's go around and just kind of get a sense from everyone where we're at, how they think the province has been doing in the wake of the first disaster and now on the way potentially to hopefully what is not a second disaster. Why don't we start, Katy, with you on that?
Yeah, I want to hone in on the Alert Ready system because in my view, there's just absolutely zero justification for the failure to use this system, which has been available since 2018. So just a reminder, Alert Ready is this like province-wide mass text messaging system that is used by other provinces in times of natural disaster or other concerns. Like, for example, Ontario has used it 200 times in the last 2 years, Saskatchewan 100 times, Alberta 80. And so I don't understand really why BC is so slow on this. I think the reasons that have been given by the government are incredibly weak. You know, we've heard that it's reserved solely for tsunamis. Like, who made that call? Why? In Alberta, we used it for COVID restrictions because it's a very effective tool to reach everyone in the province simultaneously. We've heard them say that we want to listen to the cities. And I find that a bit rich. Like that was hardly David Evy's argument when he was putting in social housing in Penticton. And we've heard that there's bugs in the system. Well, if there's bugs in the system, fix them. Like, it's been 3 years. Every other jurisdiction has figured it out. So why are we behind the 8 ball on this? I think over 600 people or almost 600 people lost their lives to heat dome in a single weekend this weekend, or this summer. You know, I feel like a mass alert system used effectively could have prevented a loss of life there. So It's inexcusable from my perspective.
We went hard on government on that last week, but the idea, I think the context that we should also bring up, though, is the letter from the Metro mayors that to the provincial government saying, we're happy with how you're using Alert Ready, which is not at all. And if you plan on using it in the future, we hope that you continue to consult with us and give us what is essentially, I think, a veto on whether or not it's going to be used, similar to how in Abbotsford, the city was able to tell the province, don't use it, and the province didn't. So I'm not sure how the province navigates all of that. Maclean, the kind of municipalities wanting to keep control of their local emergency planning, the province feeling pressure to bring Alert Ready on. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's never surprising when one level of government tries to protect what it sees as its turf. And that's, I think, largely what the mayors are doing there. But I'll feel a lot better. You may have more confidence in the mayors having final say over this if there was any evidence whatsoever that system worked. Because in BC, it doesn't. Katy's quite right to point out that it has never been used, not once, ever. And you mentioned Ontario using it over 200 times. If you think that's not a fair comparison, Alberta's used it more than 80 times in the same time period. So The mayors can say they would like to be consulted and have a veto, but the problem is that system is clearly and plainly not working, which Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth kind of admitted back in July, saying that the province needed to prioritize using the system. That was 2 disasters ago. It was used apparently this week for an active shooter situation up in Vanderhoof, which is a good. Well, just using the system is a good thing. But yeah, no, the mayors. I understand why they want to be the final say, but the system plainly does not work the way it is now.
Yeah. Sarah, lots of other ways into this, how the government is preparing or responding. There was gas rationing. There's a bunch of other ways to look at its kind of disaster preparedness. Anything jump out at you?
Yeah, I think in contrast to Alert Ready really being a story where government didn't do what I think was necessary, I'd like to focus on one thing that I think has been relatively positive, which is the decision to do gas rationing. I don't think there was a lot of choice given the circumstances. And I think this is actually an example of, on the other end of the spectrum, government being clear about communications, doing some proactive communications and filling what was a bit of a void, a lack of information. And I think it really helped to calm things down. Obviously, we're not back at normal, but I think it shows that government can play a clear role in reducing panic and anxiety. That if you don't have clear government information, that misinformation and uncertainty can fill the void. So I think government stepping in, reminding people of the collective good and the need to pull together, and setting some rules and providing some clarity is one good story out of the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I agree with you. Gas rationing or gas purchasing now has normalized, according to the fuel industry and the government, after that panic buying for a couple of days. And, government was faced with a choice of there's Trans Mountain Pipeline shut down. We're not getting any more gas in any meaningful way. Do we ration, or do we allow the market to kind of jack the price up 2-3 times and supply and demand force rationing that way? And I think they made the right decision, because we're still able to get gas, even though most of our gas supply is shut off, which is impressive, I think, despite all the kind of factors against BC on that. So I agree with you. Yeah. We will kind of watch disaster potentially for round 3, depending on how things go for next week's show, and kind of take another look at how government responded, whether it's learned kind of the lessons on the ground. Let's move on to a second topic here, which is new sick pay legislation in BC. Actually, not the legislation, just the decision on the number of days that are going to be applying here to paid sick leave. This is a year and a half after we first started talking about this idea at the start of the pandemic. 50% of workers in BC don't have paid sick leave. They can't afford not to go into work during a pandemic. If they go into work sick, they spread COVID to their coworkers, employees, and customers. So this was supposed to be government's decision on how many sick days people get. However, they chose 5 days, which seems to have pleased no one, organized labor and businesses who had different views of what the number is that government should have chosen. Sarah, sticking with you, anything jump out at you on sick pay and how government made the decision and what the kind of reaction is there?
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing for me about the sick pay announcement is how much of a kind of a non-announcement it's been. I think if this had happened before COVID, it would have been a much bigger deal. You said nobody agrees, but I think the reaction has been pretty muted, especially from the business community, because I think COVID has just made it obvious that people shouldn't have to go to work when they're sick. I think it's driven it home for the 50% of people who do have paid sick time off, that it's a public health issue, that people don't feel like they can afford to stay home when they're sick. It isn't just an issue between an individual and their employer, it affects everybody. So I think it's interesting how much the conversation has changed on this over the last year and a half. I do also think it's interesting that this is another example of the NDP choosing the middle of the road on labor policy. And this is even not being constrained by the Greens, which they like to use in the past. This is an NDP majority that's choosing 5, not the 10 plus days that the labor groups wanted. The federal Liberals are choosing 10 for federally regulated industries. So I just think that's another interesting aspect here. They like to be in the middle on labor issues.
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't know why, given everything else we're seeing from the government, they didn't just go with 10, given the kind of flexing of their majority and choosing to do what they want now. But they did, in fact, pick that middle ground. Maclean, what do you think?
I think to Sarah's point, she's quite right to point out that this, all the political considerations aside, it is kind of fascinating to watch this be a discussion we're having in real time. I remember interviewing Premier John Horgan last year about the idea of sick pay, and obviously that was still coming up. And we were talking about how a few months before the pandemic, he had shown up in the House and for a press conference. You might remember, Rob, just obviously suffering with a horrible, horrible cold, to the point where you didn't want to be in the same room. And at the time, the commentary was, good on him for, gutting through it and showing up and doing a day's work, et cetera, and so forth. When really he probably should have stayed home, even though he was the premier. So I think 5 days is better than nothing. Sarah's points that the NDP is kind of caught in government and where everything they do is going to displease somebody, and it is kind of, I will use the word amusing, watching them upset some of their traditional allies in the labor movement, especially when they're being outflanked by the Liberals with 10 days. But the fact that we are having this conversation now, even though it is late, does represent a pretty big societal shift on how we view illness, and that, at the very least, is progress.
Yeah, I think we're going to look back on this one day. This is now labor law with minimum wage, and you're right to have overtime, and I think you're right to have sick days. We'll just fit into that, and we'll think that's a no-brainer. Why didn't we have that before? But the question will be whether 5 is enough. Organized labor says that's not enough to get you tested, recover, and then symptom-free and return to work. And businesses say it's too much because they have to pay for it, especially when they're saddled with debt coming out of COVID. So it is that balancing act of a question of whether, if no one's happy with the decision, does that mean government struck the right compromise or really overshot or undershot the mark? Katie, you've had to be in the middle of those types of announcements before. How does the government kind of rationalize that?
I would say some stakeholders aren't necessarily happy, but they're also not furious. So I would actually call this a win for government in terms of reaction. They can now claim that they're the first province to introduce this. Small businesses absolutely have a point. They're going to be the most impacted, and they're understandably a bit unhappy. But I would the NDP got a fairly moderate reaction from other business associations, and Sarah was quite right. They do want to appear moderate, and so I would say that strategy worked for this announcement. And also, it's something like this. Ultimately, this is not an announcement that you're trying to appease stakeholder groups. This is very on brand with the NDP. This is proving that they are on the side of working people. And so an average worker who had no sick days before and now has 5, they're going to be pretty happy about that.
Yeah, for sure. And the average worker that doesn't have sick pay is usually of a lower pay level. They're often of a female or a racialized group, and so that dynamic of helping that minority part of the workforce is something that's very on brand for the NDP, and that's a vulnerable sector of the society that needed to have sick days. So I think you're right. I think we'll look back on this as a win and a good decision and the right decision by government, even if in the moment it's hard to find people who are super happy about it on day of. But labor law as of January 1st, so we'll see how that goes. Let's move on to the legislative session, and we're going to talk a bit about this on the TV show. Stick with us on the audio podcast for an extended discussion about it. It is the end of the fall session of the legislature. 13 bills passed, everything from the COVID bubble zone to permanent subsidies for political parties. It's not really about what passed, it's about how it passed, and this kind of frantic rush to the end with closure and bills being shut down and people interrupted in mid-speech trying to ask a question, and the legislature kind of coming to a halt and slamming the door and it being done. And we do see that happen every now and again, but that's how this session went, and there was a lot of kind of criticism, I think, about that. So in the session, how the session went, if it accomplished anything, we're still kind of waiting. I know we've talked in the past on the show, we're waiting to see that incredible NDP kind of agenda that we were told that they needed this majority for. This session was not it for sure. But Sarah, we'll start with you again. What jumped out at you about the session, and what should we be taking away from it despite all the kind of political rhetoric on all the different sides?
Yeah, the thing that jumps out for me about this session is that it is really showing that the NDP has their majority and they have gotten used to using it. And I think they're starting to operate like majority governments operate. The thing that really this underscores for me is the value of minority governments and of not entrenching majorities over and over again, because I think there's a pattern where majority governments start to privilege efficiency, getting their agenda through over transparency. They don't listen to stakeholders or watchdogs or opposition MLAs very much. They don't really value debate in the House and don't think there's a lot to learn from it. I think minorities have the opposite effect because they force the legislature to matter. I don't think this could have happened if this was a minority situation, because bill debate matters. Bills aren't predetermined to pass as is before they hit the floor of the legislature. So I think it just creates a totally different dynamic. And this for me is a reminder of why majorities can be kind of dangerous. I do think, though, to give the government some credit, at least I do think they are starting to show that they have an agenda. I think this is the first session that's had some substantive bills. The forestry bills are substantive, and that's part of the issue, obviously, is that they didn't get the debate and the scrutiny that really they should have had.
Yeah, one of those forestry bills dropped like a week before the session was over, and it didn't get It didn't get fully debated. They just ran out of time, so they were like, poof, in it goes. Yeah. Which is not great. We'll talk about that in the podcast. I don't think it's great for the legislature or the challenges of bills or understanding bills or whatever. But Katie, on the flip side of that, and I agree with Sarah, I think sometimes, majorities stiff arm the legislature as a kind of pain in its rear end that they would prefer not to have to deal with out in the real world of governing. But you've been in majority governments, and there is a flip side to that, which is if you're elected with an agenda and you want to accomplish that agenda, having a majority allows you to do it without getting stuck in a never-ending morass of trying to placate other parties that didn't win the election. So give us the other side of that and what you saw this session with the NDP.
Yeah, I've said this before on the podcast. The benefit of a majority government is you can use every tool in your toolbox to implement your agenda. And I will never fault anyone for that. Like, you can be dismissive of your opponents and ruthless in your tactics. The system is quite literally designed for that. And that's why we fight for majorities every election. I do have some constructive criticism, though. I think the government could do a better job in planning and executing their legislative agenda each session. They always seem to be behind the 8 ball on their major important communications oriented pieces of legislation. For example, like the bill to prevent protesters at hospitals and schools wasn't introduced until November 15th. And this issue was first raised in September. I think this could have been Bill 1. This could have been their first bill of the session with great fanfare. And instead there was weeks of debating an old throne speech or a missed stats bill. That makes the government look really ill-prepared and disorganized and out of ideas. And so it's a case of effective corporate planning, I think, to bring that back. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do wonder if, the House leader for government is also the Minister of Public Safety, who was having to respond to a wildfire and the COVID emergency and now disaster flooding. I wonder if that causes the House agenda to be somewhat out of whack. It's certainly not how you would do a session. This session, as you mentioned, Katie, at the beginning, there were MLAs literally doing nothing in the House, twiddling their thumbs, talking about nothing, and then wham, this avalanche of legislation lands so far late in the session, there's not even time to debate it. That's not how it should work, but maybe, we're in extraordinary times with extraordinary crises all over the place, and maybe that plays into it. I don't know. Maclean, there was a bunch of ways to view this. Did you see anything in the session that jumped out at you?
Yes, and I'm going to start by taking issue with the way you framed this segment. You said it's not about the bills that were cut off at the end there. I don't think that's true. You're right to point out that what we're talking about is the fact that they invoked time allocation and stopped debate in the middle of, literally, in one case, an MLA asking a question. And that's never good. But the problem is compounded when we're talking about really controversial and substantive issues. You mentioned the forestry bill, which even the government says amounts to a complete reinvention of one of the province's biggest industries, whether for good or ill. We're talking about one of the most controversial pieces of legislation this province has seen in years in the FOI bill. Again, cut off in the middle. Autism supports. These are really contentious issues that really could have benefited and frankly deserved really comprehensive and sustained line-by-line debate in committee, which is the explicit job of the legislature and isn't just a rubber stamp exercise. Things like committee debate are used by judges when they are reviewing cases to see what the intent of the government was. This is important. And to just cut it off without extending the session of the legislature because the government, for whatever reason, couldn't introduce these bills until very late in the session is frankly inexcusable. These issues are simply too important to be treated like that.
Yeah. I want to go back to Katy for a sec. When you hear that argument and you're in a majority government and the opposition says, can't we just stick around to debate a bill for another week? What is the pro or con of doing that? I mean, the pro is that it helps democracy.
Yes.
The con is that and how do you behind the scenes ration that out?
Well, first of all, you rarely extend the session. Governments typically don't win sessions, right? Sessions are a time for the opposition to shine, to hold the government to account, and to get, I would say, like more media attention from the public than they typically would outside of the House. So there's really no strategic benefit to the government who is simply trying to get their agenda passed to extending the session.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. I mean, question period every day is not positive for government. It's just a series of crises that they manage to barely hold on to and avoid if they're lucky. So yeah, I guess that's the political calculation of government to extending a session versus the democratic consideration of allowing MLAs to meet and discuss. And I do remember, this is old man Shaw shaking his fist at the cloud once again. I remember back in my day, John Horgan, the opposition leader, holding scrums, saying, can't we just extend the legislature for another week? I'm here. Other people are here. MLAs are here. Can't we're not done bills. It's not fair to invoke closure. It's not fair to cut people off. This is the job of the legislature. We should stay. And now his government uses all those same tools because you're right, because it doesn't want to be sitting there in a risky situation getting hammered on various issues when it doesn't have good responses on some of them. So it's an
and those are
Go ahead. Yeah.
Those are such important tactics for the opposition to use. Like the theatrics are important. Like ask for a session extension, ask for an all-night sitting, like really show that you're there to do the work on behalf of British Columbians. I think that's key. And it's not surprising that these tactics are used by all political parties.
Yeah, and then every now and again, someone calls the bluff and says, yeah, let's do an all-night sitting. And then everyone's like, oh, no, not an all-night sitting. But anyways, yeah. All right, stick with us because we got more on that topic on the audio podcast. If you're watching us on TV, thank you so much for joining us this week on Political Capital, and we will see you next week.